Between 1923 and 1938, the Sacred Heart Sanctuary in Mobile, Alabama, claimed to shelter over 800 refugees, yet only 557 ever left its gates alive. The discovery came by accident in 1982, when construction workers renovating the basement of the abandoned Sacred Heart Sanctuary uncovered a hidden chamber beneath the main chapel. Inside, they found 243 identification documents, personal belongings, and handwritten letters in 17 different languages, all belonging to refugees who had supposedly been relocated to other cities decades earlier. The documents were meticulously organized in wooden filing cabinets, each folder containing a photograph, arrival date, and a final entry stamp marked simply PROCESSED. What they didn't find were the people themselves. The FBI investigation that followed would reveal one of the most systematic and carefully orchestrated disappearance operations in American religious history, conducted under the guise of Christian charity in the heart of the Deep South. The Sacred Heart Sanctuary of Mobile, Alabama, stood as a beacon of Christian compassion during some of America's darkest decades. Established in 1919 by Father William Harris, a Jesuit priest who had witnessed firsthand the humanitarian crisis following World War I, the sanctuary initially served as a temporary shelter for European war refugees seeking passage to relatives in the American interior. By 1923, it had expanded into a comprehensive refugee assistance program that would become the model for similar operations across the southeastern United States. Father Harris, a tall, austere man with penetrating gray eyes and an unwavering commitment to what he called practical Christianity, had arrived in Mobile after serving as a military chaplain in France. The horrors he witnessed in the trenches, had convinced him that God's work required more than prayers, it demanded action. The Sacred Heart Parish, located in Mobile's historic downtown district just blocks from the bustling port, provided the perfect location for his vision. The church itself was an impressive Gothic revival structure, completed in 1901, featuring soaring spires and stained glass windows that depicted scenes of Christ welcoming the stranger. But it was the extensive complex of buildings behind the main church that would become the heart of Harris's operation. The sanctuary complex covered nearly 3 city blocks and included dormitories capable of housing up to 200 people at a time, a medical clinic staffed by volunteer physicians, a dining hall that could serve over 400 meals daily, and administrative offices where refugees received assistance with documentation, job placement, and travel arrangements. The facility operated with military precision, a reflection of Harris's background and his belief that efficiency was a form of Christian service. Refugees typically stayed between 2 weeks and 3 months while their cases were processed and arrangements made for their final. Local newspapers regularly featured stories about the sanctuary's work, often highlighting individual success stories of families reunited or refugees who had found employment and permanent homes through the program. The Mobile Register ran a weekly column called New Americans that profiled recent arrivals and their integration into American society. Business leaders, city officials, and prominent citizens served on the sanctuary's board of directors, lending their names and financial support to what was universally regarded as a noble cause. The sanctuary's reputation extended far beyond Mobile's city limits. Religious organizations throughout the South sent delegations to study Harris's methods and implement similar programs in their own community. The facility received regular visits from government officials, including representatives from the newly established Immigration and Naturalization Service, who praised its efficient processing procedures and comprehensive record-keeping. In 1925, Father Harris was invited to Washington to advise the State Department on refugee assistance policies, a recognition that elevated his status within both religious and political circles. Financial support flowed in from multiple sources. The Catholic Church provided substantial funding through its national refugee assistance programs, but the sanctuary also received significant donations from Protestant denominations, Jewish organizations, and secular humanitarian groups. Local businesses contributed supplies, services, and job opportunities for refugees ready to begin their new life. The city of Mobile provided utilities and maintenance support, viewing the sanctuary as both a humanitarian asset and an economic benefit that brought federal attention and resources to Staff members were carefully selected from among the most respected members of the religious community. Sister Margaret Wells, a nun with extensive experience in social work, served as the facility's Director of Resident Services, overseeing the day-to-day care of refugees. Dr. James Franklin, a respected local physician, provided medical services and maintained health records for all residents. Thomas Lambert, a former immigration officer who had converted to Catholicism after meeting Father Harris, managed the complex documentation and legal processes required for refugee resettlement. The sanctuary's success was measured not only in numbers, but in the quality of outcomes for those it served. Follow-up studies conducted by religious organizations showed that over 90% of refugees processed through Sacred Heart successfully integrated into American communities, found stable employment, and maintained contact with the church that had helped them. These statistics were regularly cited in fundraising materials and congressional testimony supporting expanded refugee assistance programs. By 1930, the Sacred Heart Sanctuary was processing over 300 refugees annually, making it one of the largest and most successful refugee assistance programs in the southeastern United States. The facility had expanded to include vocational training workshops, English language classes, and a legal aid clinic staffed by volunteer attorneys. Father Harris had become a nationally recognized figure in humanitarian circles, frequently invited to speak at conferences and religious gatherings about the moral imperative of refugee assistance. The sanctuary's influence extended into academia as well. Social work programs at universities throughout the region sent students to Mobile for internships and practical training. Research studies examining the effectiveness of faith-based humanitarian programs invariably cited Sacred Heart as a model of successful integration between religious mission and professional social service delivery. Several doctoral dissertations were written analyzing the sanctuary's methods and their potential for replication in other communities. Local integration was another hallmark of the sanctuary's approach. Rather than isolating refugees within the facility, Harris encouraged interaction with the broader Mobile community. Regular cultural events showcased the traditions and contributions of different refugee groups, helping to build understanding and acceptance among local residents. Many refugees remained in Mobile after completing the program, becoming permanent members of local congregations and civic organizations. The sanctuary's annual festival, featuring food, music, and crafts from dozens of countries, became one of Mobile's most popular community events. The financial transparency of the operation further enhanced its reputation. Annual reports detailed every aspect of the sanctuary's finances, from major donations to operational expenses. Independent audits regularly confirmed the efficient use of funds, with administrative costs kept below 10% of total expenditures. This level of accountability was unusual for religious organizations of the era and contributed significantly to the program's credibility with donors and government officials. Media coverage consistently portrayed the sanctuary and its leadership in heroic terms. Father Harris was featured on the cover of religious magazines and profiled in national newspapers as an example of faith in action. Photojournalists documented the arrival of refugee families, their time at the sanctuary, and their eventual departure to new lives elsewhere in America. These images, showing grateful families embracing Father Harris and other staff members, became iconic representations of American compassion and Christian charity. The sanctuary's reputation was so sterling that criticism was virtually non-existent. Occasional questions about the fate of refugees who seemed to disappear between arrival and departure were dismissed as clerical errors or misunderstandings about intended destinations. The few individuals who raised concerns about the sanctuary's operations were typically outsiders with no direct knowledge of the program, and their questions were easily deflected by pointing to the overwhelming evidence of the sanctuary's success and the testimonials of grateful refugees who had been helped. The first documented concern about irregularities at the Sacred Heart Sanctuary came from an unexpected source, the United States Postal Service. In late 1924, Postal Inspector Carl Bennett noticed an unusual pattern in mail delivery to the facility. While hundreds of letters arrived weekly addressed to refugees staying at the sanctuary, very few letters were ever sent out by residents. Bennett, A meticulous man who had worked the mobile route for over 15 years found this pattern curious given that most refugees were supposedly maintaining contact with family members in other cities while awaiting reunification. Bennett's concerns deepened when he began tracking registered mail and money transfers. Families across the country regularly sent funds to relatives at the sanctuary, but the pattern of outgoing financial transactions didn't match what he would expect from a population preparing to When he raised these observations with his supervisor, he was told that the sanctuary's internal mail system might be handling outgoing correspondence differently, and that postal inspectors should focus on delivery. About private institutional practices, similar patterns emerged in other seemingly routine interactions with the sanctuary. Railway ticket agents in Mobile's train station noted that while the sanctuary regularly purchased large blocks of tickets for the actual number of refugees observed boarding trains seemed inconsistent with the volume of ticket sales. Station manager Eugene Hoffman mentioned this discrepancy to several colleagues, but the explanation offered by sanctuary staff that many refugees traveled at night or used alternative transportation arrangements seemed plausible enough that no formal inquiry was initiated. Local physicians who occasionally provided services at the sanctuary began noticing troubling inconsistencies in medical records. Dr. Raymond Elliott, who volunteered at the facility's clinic once monthly, observed that while new refugees arrived regularly requiring medical examinations and vaccinations, he rarely saw the same individuals on subsequent visits. When he inquired about the health outcomes of specific patients he had treated, he was told they had been transferred to other facilities or had completed their processing. The rapid turnover seemed unusually high, but Dr. Elliott's concerns were dismissed by Dr. Franklin, who explained that the sanctuary's efficiency in processing cases meant shorter average stays. More troubling were the observations of Alice Norton, a social worker from the State Welfare Department, who conducted periodic inspections of the facility as part of her oversight responsibilities. Norton noted significant inconsistencies between the sanctuary's reported resident population and the number of individuals she actually encountered during her visits. When she requested to interview specific refugees whose cases she was monitoring, she was often told they had unexpectedly departed or were unavailable due to illness or other circumstances. Her reports documented these discrepancies, but were filed without follow-up investigation, as the sanctuary's stellar reputation and the personal assurances of Father Harris carried more weight than the concerns of a junior state employee. The most serious early warning came from within the sanctuary itself. Sister Marie Douglas, a young nun assigned to assist with meal preparation, began keeping informal notes about the residents she served. Her daily logs, maintained for personal reflection and prayer purposes, revealed disturbing patterns that contradicted official records. Refugees who appeared on her meal service lists would disappear without explanation, but their names were to appear on official rosters for weeks afterward. When she brought these inconsistencies to Sister Margaret Wells, she was told that the complexity of processing multiple cases simultaneously sometimes resulted in administrative delays in updating records. Sister Douglas's concerns intensified when she began finding personal belongings left behind by refugees who had supposedly departed for new destinations. Clothing, photographs, religious items, and other possessions that refugees had guarded carefully during their stays were discovered in storage areas and unused dormitory rooms. When she inquired about procedures for forwarding these items to their owners, she was instructed to donate them to local charities, as attempting to track down departed refugees would be impractical and local law enforcement received several reports that should have triggered investigations, but were dismissed due to the sanctuary's reputation. Detective Frank Reynolds of the Mobile Police Department documented at least 6 missing person reports filed by family members who had lost contact with relatives staying at the sanctuary. In each case, sanctuary officials provided documentation showing that the missing individuals had been successfully relocated to other cities, complete with forwarding addresses and contact information. However, when family members attempted to reach their relatives at these addresses, they found that the locations either didn't exist or that no one by those names had ever lived there. The pattern of ignored warning signs extended to federal agencies as well. Immigration officials conducting routine compliance inspections noted discrepancies between the sanctuary's reported statistics and their own records of refugee documentation. The sanctuary claimed to have processed and relocated hundreds of individuals whose paperwork never appeared in federal immigration files. When these inconsistencies were brought to the attention of supervisors, they were attributed to the complex and often informal nature of refugee assistance work during a period when federal immigration procedures were still being standardized. Financial irregularities also emerged, but were overlooked due to the sanctuary's reputation for fiscal responsibility. Bank records showed regular large cash withdrawals from sanctuary accounts that didn't correspond to documented operational expenses. Thomas Lambert explained these transactions as payments to private transportation companies and individual sponsors who preferred cash transactions. The explanations were accepted without detailed investigation, as the sanctuary's overall financial management remained exemplary in all other respects. The most disturbing warning sign came from Martha Steele, a local seamstress who provided clothing repair services for the sanctuary. Steele noticed that she was frequently asked to mend the same types of garments: torn clothing, items with what appeared to be bloodstains, and garments that seemed to have been damaged in struggles or violent encounters. When she asked about the unusual condition of these items, she was told that refugees often arrived in poor condition after difficult journeys, and that accidents during manual labor were unfortunately common. Steele's concerns grew when she realized that the volume of damaged clothing far exceeded what would be expected from a population engaged in normal daily activities. Community members who lived near the sanctuary reported unusual nighttime activities that should have prompted investigation. Neighbors observed trucks making deliveries and departures at odd hours, often with covered cargo that prevented identification of contents. Strange sounds, including what some described as muffled screams or calls for help, were reported to police but dismissed as the normal sounds of a large residential facility housing individuals who might be experiencing emotional distress related to their refugee experience. Perhaps most significantly, several refugees who had successfully completed the program and established new lives elsewhere attempted to return to Mobile to visit the sanctuary or to seek assistance for family members. These individuals reported being turned away at the sanctuary gates and told that return visits were not permitted for security reasons. Some were given false information about the facility's closure or relocation. When these former residents persisted in their attempts to make contact, they were threatened with legal action for trespassing. The cumulative effect of these warning signs should have triggered a comprehensive investigation, but the sanctuary's reputation proved to be an impenetrable shield against scrutiny. Each individual concern was explained away or dismissed as a misunderstanding, and the overwhelming positive publicity surrounding the facility's work made it virtually impossible for critics to gain a hearing. The institutional credibility that Father Harris had so carefully cultivated became the very mechanism that allowed systematic atrocities to undetected for over a decade. Local officials, religious leaders, and community members had numerous opportunities to recognize the patterns that indicated serious problems at the same time. However, the cognitive dissonance between the facility's public image and the disturbing evidence of wrongdoing was too great for most people to reconcile. It was easier to dismiss individual concerns as misunderstandings than to confront the possibility that one of Mobile's most respected institutions was engaged in systematic criminal activity. The first crack in the Sacred Heart Sanctuary's facade came from an unexpected source: a routine city building inspection in March 1930. Inspector Harold Price was conducting a standard fire safety evaluation when he noticed that the sanctuary's reported capacity and the actual dormitory space didn't align with city records. The discrepancy led him to request architectural plans, which revealed significant structural modifications that had never been approved or inspected. Most troubling was the discovery of a sealed basement area beneath the main chapel that didn't appear on any official building plans. When Price demanded access to this hidden space, Father Harris initially claimed it was simply unused storage area that had been sealed due to moisture problems. However, Price's insistence on a complete inspection led to the unsealing of what would prove to be a chamber of horrors that had operated in secret for nearly 15 years. The basement space had been converted into a series of cells, each barely large enough for a single person, with heavy metal doors and no windows. The concrete floors showed extensive staining that would later be confirmed as human blood. The investigation that followed would uncover one of the most systematic and carefully orchestrated murder operations in American criminal history. FBI agents, called in at the request of local officials who recognized they were dealing with something far beyond their capabilities, discovered evidence of at least 243 confirmed murders spanning the period from 1923 to 1938. The victims were refugees who had entered the sanctuary seeking help and safety, only to become prey for a network of individuals who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation and violence. Documentation found in Father Harris's private office revealed the true nature of the sanctuary's operation. What appeared to be a legitimate refugee assistance program was actually an elaborate selection and elimination system. Refugees were categorized upon arrival, based on criteria that included their likelihood of being missed by family members, their financial resources, and their perceived vulnerability. Those deemed suitable for the program's true purpose were gradually isolated from other residents and subjected to a process that ultimately led. The selection process was methodical and cold-blooded. Thomas Lambert maintained detailed files on each refugee, including information about their family connections, financial resources, and the likelihood that their disappearance would trigger outside investigation. Refugees with strong family ties, or those who maintained regular correspondence with relatives in other locations, were typically processed through the legitimate assistance program and actually relocated as promised. However, those who were isolated, had limited English skills or possessed valuable resources, were marked for what the documents euphemistically termed special processing. Sister Margaret Wells, far from being the compassionate caregiver she appeared to be, was revealed as the operation's primary coordinator. Her role in resident services provided perfect cover for identifying vulnerable victims and orchestrating their isolation from other refugees. She maintained a separate set of records that tracked the psychological profiles of residents, noting which individuals were most likely to comply with instructions and least likely to resist when moved to the basement cells. The murder method was designed to minimize evidence and maximize the recovery of valuable possessions from victims. Refugees selected for elimination were told they were being moved to a special housing area while their final travel arrangements were completed. They were led to the basement cells, where they were systematically robbed of any valuables, tortured for information about additional resources or family members who might possess wealth, and eventually killed through methods that included strangulation, stabbing, and blunt force trauma. Dr. James Franklin's medical expertise was perverted to serve the operation's needs. Forensic examination of the basement chamber revealed evidence of crude medical experiments conducted on victims before their deaths. Franklin appeared to have used refugees as test subjects for various procedures and drug trials, treating human beings as laboratory animals. His medical records, hidden behind false walls in his office, documented these experiments with the same clinical detachment. The disposal of bodies was handled through a network of accomplices that extended beyond the sanctuary itself. Investigation revealed connections to local funeral homes, crematoriums, and even medical schools that received bodies for anatomical study. Bodies were typically dismembered in the basement facility, with parts distributed to various disposal sites to prevent discovery. Some remains were burned in the sanctuary's own furnace, while others were buried in unmarked graves on church property or disposed of in Mobile Bay. Financial records uncovered the economic motivation behind the murders. The sanctuary received payment not only for each refugee supposedly processed through the legitimate program, but also profited from the theft of victims' possessions and resources. Many refugees arrived carrying life savings in cash, jewelry, and other valuables. These resources were systematically stolen and converted to support the sanctuary's operations and enrich the conspirators. Bank records showed regular deposits that far exceeded the facility's documented income from legitimate sources. The investigation revealed that the operation had grown increasingly sophisticated over. Early murders appeared to have been opportunistic crimes against particularly vulnerable individuals, but the system evolved into a calculated selection and elimination process. By the early 1930s, The conspirators had developed detailed protocols for victim selection, isolation, exploitation, and they had also established relationships with corrupt officials and other criminal networks that provided protection and resources for their activities. Survivor testimony provided the most harrowing details of the sanctuary's operation. Edna Lawson, a Polish refugee who had managed to escape from the basement, provided investigators with first-hand accounts of the systematic torture and murder witnessed. Lawson had been selected for elimination after sanctuary staff discovered she had been carrying gold coins sewn into her clothing. She spent 6 weeks in the basement cells, during which time she watched 12 other refugees die under horrific circumstances. According to Lawson's testimony, victims were kept alive for extended periods while being systematically tortured for information about hidden resources or family members who might possess weapons. The basement contained a variety of instruments designed to inflict pain without causing immediate death. Refugees were beaten, burned, and subjected to medical procedures without anesthesia while being questioned about their backgrounds and those who cooperated by revealing information about family wealth or hidden valuables might be killed quickly, while those who resisted faced prolonged agony. The investigation also uncovered evidence of sexual violence against both male and female. The basement cells contained restraints and other equipment that indicated refugees were subjected to sexual assault as part. Medical examinations of remains found in various disposal sites confirmed patterns of sexual violence that had occurred before death. This aspect of the crimes appeared to serve both as a method of psychological torture and as personal gratification for some of the perpetrators. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that some victims had been kept alive for months while being systematically exploited. Several cells contained evidence of long-term habitation, including makeshift bedding and crude waste disposal arrangements. Survivors' accounts and physical evidence suggested that some refugees were used as forced labor for sanctuary operations while being held captive in the basement. Others were kept alive to provide ongoing information about family members and resources that could be exploited. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate sanctuary staff. Investigation revealed a network of accomplices that included local business owners, funeral directors, medical professionals, and even some law enforcement officials. These individuals provided services, resources, and protection that enabled the murder operation to undetected for 15 years. The conspiracy involved at least 30 confirmed accomplices, many of whom held respected positions in Mobil's religious and business communities. Evidence also suggested that the Sacred Heart Sanctuary was not an isolated operation, but part of a larger network of similar facilities operating in other cities. Correspondence found in Father Harris's files indicated contact with similar operations in Birmingham, Atlanta, and New Orleans. While investigations in these cities would later be hampered by destroyed evidence and uncooperative witnesses, there were strong indications that the systematic murder of refugees was occurring at multiple locations throughout the southeastern United States. The investigation revealed that the operation had been planned to indefinitely. Construction plans found in the sanctuary's files showed designs for expanding the basement facility to accommodate larger numbers of victims. The conspirators had also been developing new methods for disposing of remains and had established relationships with criminal networks in other states that could provide additional disposal services. The only factor that brought the operation to an end was the accidental discovery during the building inspection. Financial analysis showed that the murder operation had generated enormous profits for the conspirators. Conservative estimates suggested that the theft of victims' resources had netted over $2 million in 1930s currency, equivalent to tens of millions in today's money. These funds had been used to purchase property, invest in local businesses, and maintain lifestyles far beyond what would be expected from legitimate religious work. Father Harris alone had accumulated personal wealth equivalent to several $1 million through his participation in the murder. The psychological profiles of the perpetrators, developed by federal investigators and consulting psychiatrists, revealed individuals who had become completely desensitized to human suffering. Interviews with arrested conspirators showed no evidence of remorse or recognition that their victims were human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. They spoke of refugees as problems to be solved or resources to be exploited, demonstrating a level of dehumanization that shocked even experienced criminal investigators. Evidence suggested that the operation had been escalating in both scope and brutality over time. Early murders appeared to have been relatively quick killings, motivated primarily by theft, but later crimes showed evidence of prolonged torture and sadistic violence, far beyond what would be necessary for robbery. The perpetrators appeared to have developed an appetite for inflicting suffering that transformed the operation from a criminal enterprise into something approaching systematic genocide. The discovery of the sanctuary's true nature sent shockwaves through Mobile's religious and civic communities. Many prominent citizens who had supported the facility and praised Father Harris found themselves questioning their judgment and wondering how they had been so completely deceived. The revelation that one of the city's most respected institutions had been operating as a murder factory destroyed faith in religious authority and institutional credibility that would take decades to reach. The arrest of Father William Harris and his conspirators in April 19 should have marked the beginning of justice for the 243 refugees who had been murdered at the Sacred Heart Sanctuary. Instead, it initiated one of the most comprehensive cover-up operations in American criminal history. Within hours of the arrests, powerful forces began working to minimize the scandal and protect the broader institutions that had enabled the crimes to undetected for 15 years. The Catholic Church's response was swift and calculated. Cardinal Joseph Carter, who oversaw church operations in the southeastern United States, arrived in Mobile within days of the arrests and immediately took control of the sanctuary property. Church officials claimed they needed to secure religious artifacts and documents, but their real purpose was to remove or destroy evidence that might implicate other church facilities or higher-ranking clergy members. Truckloads of documents were removed from the sanctuary and transported to church headquarters, where they were reportedly destroyed to protect the privacy of innocent refugees. Legal proceedings against the arrested conspirators were hampered from the beginning by the systematic destruction of evidence and the sudden unavailability of key witnesses. Thomas Lambert, who had maintained the detailed records of victim selection and disposal, was found dead in his jail cell just 3 days after his arrest. Officials ruled his death a suicide, claiming he had hanged himself with bedsheets, but the circumstances raised immediate questions about potential murder to prevent his testimony. His death eliminated the one person who could have provided comprehensive details about the entire operation. Sister Margaret Wells suffered a similar fate, dying in police custody, allegedly from a heart attack brought on by the stress of her arrest. However, the attending physician noted unusual symptoms that were consistent with poisoning, and her body showed signs of recent injection marks that were never adequately explained. Dr. James Franklin was found dead in his home the night before he was scheduled to give testimony to federal investigators. Police reported that he had apparently suffered a stroke, but family members noted that valuable documents and research materials had been removed from his home before authorities arrived. Father Harris himself proved to be the most problematic witness for the cover-up operation. Unlike his co-conspirators, he seemed prepared to provide detailed testimony about the murders and the broader network of similar operations. However, his mental condition deteriorated rapidly and psychiatrists declared him incompetent to stand trial. He was transferred to a private psychiatric facility operated by the Catholic Church, where he remained until his death in 1950. During his 5 years of institutionalization, he was never allowed to speak with investigators, journalists, or family members of victims. The few conspirators who survived long enough to face trial received surprisingly lenient sentences considering the magnitude of their crimes. Most were convicted of lesser charges such as fraud or conspiracy rather than murder, as prosecutors claimed that the destruction of evidence made it impossible to prove specific killings. The longest sentence imposed was 15 years, and most defendants served less than 5 years before being released on parole. Several were reportedly provided with new identities and relocated to other states after their release. Evidence destruction extended far beyond the removal of documents from the sanctuary itself. The basement chamber where the murders had occurred was sealed with concrete, and the entire building was demolished within months of the investigation's conclusion. Church officials claimed the demolition was necessary for public safety, but critics argued it was designed to eliminate physical evidence that might support future prosecutions or civil lawsuits. The site was converted into a parking lot, with no memorial or acknowledgement of what had occurred there. Federal investigators found their efforts systematically undermined by lack of cooperation from local officials and interference from Washington. FBI agents reported that their superiors were under pressure from high-ranking government officials to limit the scope of the investigation and avoid pursuing leads that might implicate other institutions or reveal the broader network of similar operations. Several agents were reassigned to other cases just as they were making significant progress in uncovering the conspiracy's full extent. The few survivors of the sanctuary's operations faced ongoing harassment and intimidation that effectively silenced their testimony. Edna Lawson, whose escape had provided crucial evidence about the murders, was reportedly threatened by unknown individuals who warned her against speaking to investigators or journalists. She was eventually relocated by federal marshals to a secret location, but her testimony was ruled inadmissible in court due to questions about her mental stability following her traumatic experiences. She died in 1947 under suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated. Media coverage of the scandal was carefully controlled and minimized through a combination of legal pressure and financial incentives. Major newspapers that initially covered the story extensively gradually reduced their coverage and eventually stopped reporting on the case. Editors claimed that reader interest had declined, but internal documents later revealed that powerful advertisers and political figures had pressured media outlets to drop their coverage. Several journalists who attempted to investigating the story found themselves unemployed or transferred to other assignments. The broader refugee assistance network throughout the southeastern United States underwent significant changes following the mobile revelations, but these changes were designed more to prevent future scandals than to address the systematic problems that had enabled the murders. Several similar facilities were quietly closed without explanation, and their records were sealed or destroyed. Staff members at these facilities were reassigned to other positions without background investigations that might have revealed their involvement in similar criminal activities. Compensation for victims' families was effectively prevented through a series of legal and bureaucratic obstacles. The Catholic Church claimed that it bore no responsibility for the actions of individual clergy members and that the sanctuary had been operating independently of church oversight. Government agencies argued that they had no obligation to compensate foreign nationals who had been in the country illegally or without proper documentation. The few families who attempted to pursue civil lawsuits found their cases dismissed on technical grounds or delayed until statute of limitations periods expired. The physical evidence of the crimes was systematically eliminated or hidden from public view. Human remains discovered at various disposal sites were quietly reburied in unmarked graves without proper identification or notification of families. Personal belongings found in the sanctuary's hidden chambers were reportedly returned to families, but most relatives never received any items or information. The elaborate documentation system that the perpetrators had maintained was almost entirely destroyed, eliminating the possibilities or tracing the full scope of the operation. Local officials and community leaders who had supported the sanctuary worked aggressively to rehabilitate their own reputations and distance themselves from the scandal. Many claimed they had been deceived by the perpetrator's elaborate facade and argued that no reasonable person could have detected the criminal activities. Board members and major donors established a narrative that portrayed themselves as victims of an elaborate deception rather than negligent overseers who had failed to properly monitor the facility's operations. The impact on Mobile's refugee assistance programs was devastating and long-lasting. Public trust in charitable organizations plummeted, and legitimate assistance programs struggled to attract volunteers, donors, or clients. The city's reputation as a welcoming destination for immigrants and refugees was permanently damaged, contributing to economic decline as international businesses and organizations relocated their operations to other cities. The psychological trauma extended throughout the community, as residents struggled to reconcile their memories of supporting a respected institution with the reality of having unknowingly enabled mass murder. Perhaps most troubling was the evidence that similar operations continued in other locations, despite the mobile revelations. Investigations in other cities were systematically hindered by lack of federal support, local resistance, and the destruction of evidence. Several facilities that appeared to be operating along similar lines to the Sacred Heart Sanctuary were allowed to close quietly without thorough investigation. Reports of missing refugees and suspicious activities at other church-operated facilities were dismissed or ignored by authorities who appeared determined to prevent additional scandals. The long-term consequences of the cover-up extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The systematic suppression of evidence and testimony established dangerous precedents for how institutional crimes would be handled in the future. The message sent to other potential perpetrators was that even the most heinous crimes could be covered up if they involved respected institutions and powerful protectors. This precedent would contribute to similar cover-ups of institutional abuse in decades to come. By 1945, just 7 years after the public memory of the scandal had been effectively erased through a combination of media silence, document destruction, and the relocation of key figures. New residents of Mobile often had no knowledge of what had occurred at the Sacred Heart Sanctuary, and long-time residents were reluctant to discuss the events. The site where 243 refugees had been systematically murdered became a forgotten parking lot, with no marker or memorial to acknowledge the victims or warn future generations about the capacity for evil within seemingly benevolent institutions. The files on the Sacred Heart Sanctuary case were sealed by federal order in 1950, and remain classified to this day. Requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act have been consistently denied on grounds of national security and privacy protection. The official position of the government is that releasing details about the case would compromise ongoing investigations, though no evidence of such investigations has ever been made public. The truth about what happened in Mobile and the broader network of similar operations that may have existed remains hidden behind layers of institutional secrecy and deliberate amnesia. Today, few Americans have heard of the Sacred Heart Sanctuary or the 243 refugees who disappeared within its walls. The story has been effectively erased from historical memory, existing only in classified government files, and the fading memories of a few elderly residents who remember when Mobile's most respected institution was revealed to be a factory of death. The victims, already marginalized by their status as refugees seeking help in a foreign land, have been erased a second time by the systematic suppression of their story and the protection of those who failed to prevent their murders. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.